In this lesson, we'll look at using Flood Fill Select to select whole pieces of connected geometry and to select components within selection boundaries. In the last lesson, we used the Edge cusp node to split a single piece of connected geometry into multiple pieces, and I'll just drop down and explode a View node again so that we can clearly see those individual pieces. If we wanted to select one of these white rigid rings, or the flexible rubber parts in between, then in primitive selection mode, we can just double click to select the whole connected piece. We can do the same when we're in point selection mode, so I'll just tap the 2 key to switch to point selection, and now if I double click on one of these points, we see that we select all the points on the connected piece. If I switch to edge selection mode though, and double click on one of these edges, then as we've seen in earlier lessons, double clicking on an edge selects the whole edge loop, rather than the whole connected piece. So what we can do in this case is Flood Fill Select, and we do that by holding down the H key and clicking. And there we see that we select all the edges on the connected piece of geometry. We can use Flood Fill Select to select any type of component. For example, if I tap the 4 key to switch back to primitive selection mode, and now rather than double clicking to select the whole connected piece, I can hold down the H key and click to select the whole connected piece that way. If you're using a tablet rather than a mouse, then the H key plus left click is often quite a bit easier than double clicking. The way that Flood Fill Selecting works is that it floods the selection within a given boundary. So when I hold down the H key and click on one of these pieces, it selects all the primitives within the boundary of the geometry. And the boundary of the geometry is these unshared edges on either side. These are the extents of the geometry. We can also define a boundary using another selection. For example, if I just bypass this edge cusp mode so that the hose becomes a single piece of connected geometry again, and I can just confirm that it's now a single connected piece by holding down the H key and clicking on one of these primitives, and we see that the entire hose gets selected. So now if I wanted to select the bottom half of this hose, then I can select a loop of primitives in the middle to define a boundary, and I'll do that by selecting one primitive and then holding down the A key and middle clicking on this second one. Now I can just hold down the H key and click anywhere between the end of the hose and this selected loop to flood fill that selection, and we see that that selects everything within the defined boundary. You'll notice that the original loop that I selected hasn't been included in this selection, but if we want to do that, we just hold down the Shift key together with the H key. So I'll just undo that, and this time I'll hold down Shift H and click, and now that original primitive loop's included in the selection. If we wanted to select the middle section of the hose, then we can define the boundary using 2 loop selections. So for example, I'll select a loop of primitives here, and I'll hold down the Shift key and select a second loop of primitives here. Now I can just hold down the H key and click to flood select all the primitives between those 2 selected loops. Now with this specific hose shape, it wouldn't be all that hard to select these primitives using a lasso selection, but if I come over to this other example here, where I have this coiled up hose, then with something like this, it would be much harder to select part of the hose using the standard selection tools. For example, say we wanted to remove this last part of the hose between the end and where it meets the 3 o'clock position. If I try and use the lasso tool to draw a selection around the area that I want to delete, it's clearly going to be a slow and tricky process. Brush selecting is a bit better, but even if you've got a steady hand, it's still pretty slow. A much simpler way would be to select the primitives by flood fill. So I'll select the first rigid segment that I want to remove by switching back to box select mode, and I'll drag a box selection across the whole loop in the center of that segment. Now I'll grow that selection a couple of times using Shift G until I've selected the whole white rigid part. Now I'll just zoom out a bit, and I'll hold down Shift and the H key and click to select all the primitives between the selection and the end of the hose. And we see that that's a much quicker way of making that selection. And now I can just hit the delete key to remove those selected primitives. So in this lesson, we've seen how we can use Flood Fill Select to select geometry components within a defined boundary.